All right. Looking at the 30th lesson on the study of the biblical flood. Everyone seeing the slides?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
All right. Now we're going to look into the Bible itself for references to ice and snow. That's what we'll be looking at. In Genesis 8:22, while the earth remaineth, this is after the flood, see? Seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. So the seasons will come back. So what we have is we have seed time and harvest, we have cold and heat, all of this summer and winter, day and night. And all of this shall not cease. That's kind of implying that there was some kind of a change in things, perhaps during the flood, during the year of the flood. Of course, there was no seed time and harvest, and we don't know whether there's cold before the flood or not. The Bible does not have the mention of the word cold or ice or snow before the flood. But the fact that it doesn't mention it doesn't mean it didn't occur. However, my model does not have snow and ice occurring before the flood. And of course, if the Bible mentioned them before the flood, my model wouldn't work. But the fact that it doesn't mention them leaves that as an open question. It will still, my model will fit or harmonize with what the Bible actually says. Now, it would be the logical fallacy of denying the antecedent if I made this following argument. If I said, if the Bible mentions ice before the flood, then there was ice before the flood. Well, that would certainly be true. That premise would be true. Nothing wrong with it. But then you turn around and say the Bible does not mention ice before the flood. Well, that's denying the antecedent, which is a logical fallacy. And then I would conclude that there was no ice before the flood. That's not true. That's not necessarily proven. It might be true, but it's not proven by that argument. So again, I'm not making that argument. I'm just saying my model requires that there not be ice before the flood, and the Bible does not mention ice before the flood. All right. Now, look at Job 6:16. I think Job was a post-flood, after the flood patriarch, which are black by reason of the ice, and wherein the snow hideth itself. So right here, Job is writing, and he's apparently from the region not far from what we call Palestine or Canaan land. The Bible calls Canaan land of Canaan. He's not far from that, and he talks about snow and ice. And that's not very common in that region of the world. Now, I realize that some of the mountains there get snow in Israel, and it does snow in Jerusalem sometimes in the winter. Occasionally it does. But by and large, it's a subtropical climate. Now, in Job 9:30, if I wash myself with snow water, make my hands never so clean. We need to try to determine as best we can. I'm not sure we can do this with any assurance, the location of where Job lived. Now, some of the places he named are to the east of Israel. And it appears that some of those places are places where there's no snow falling today. So the climate has been changing since that time. So he's talking about snow water, he's talking about ice in these passages, day and cold and heat, snow and ice, snow water. And so again, we see something different about their climate at that time. In Job 24:9, I think Job is the oldest book in the Bible. And my dating of it, I would date it around 2000 BC. And it's the oldest book in the Bible. Now, it doesn't have the oldest material in it, but I think it was the first book written in the Bible. Drought and heat and consume the snow waters. so does Sheol those that have sinned. So snow waters were melting, and drought and heat would consume them, evaporate them. So they were getting snow where he was living at that time. So snow did come. And so again, he's using a figure of speech here, figurative language, of course, but he's still talking about snow waters. Hast thou entered the treasures of the snow, or hast thou seen the treasures of the hail? So have you seen the treasures? And we see snow, and of course hail. Hail occurs in a lot of places that are warm. In Oklahoma, it occurs in the summer or in the spring quite a lot. But the weather is maybe fairly warm on the ground, but the hail falls. But we won't worry about that. We see snow here. Snow reaching the ground indicates that it's cold. It has to be cold, otherwise the snow would melt. In Job 37:6, whereupon were the foundations thereof fastened, who hath laid the cornerstone thereof? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy, who shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth, as if it had issued out of the womb. So now right here, whatever this is like it's issuing out of the womb. And the waters, when it brake forth, as if it had issued out of the womb. When I made clouds the garment thereof, and thick darkness a swaddling cloth, and marked out for it as my bound, and set bars and doors. So again, right here, I think this may be talking about the flood. It's quite clear that shut the sea with doors. So the sea then overran, as we've already set forth, the sea was pulled over the land, out of whose womb, in this same context. Now let's go back in Job 37:6 here. Then in 38:29, out of whose womb came forth the ice, and the hoary frost of heaven, who hath gendered it. Now I know it's figurative language, but it's as if the ice came in a sudden place. The waters hide themselves and become like stone. Well, when waters become like stone, they're frozen. So whatever this ice is that came forth as from a womb froze the waters. Take pretty cold ice to freeze the waters, particularly if they were salt waters. Salt water freezes about 10 or 12 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on how much salt's in it. And the face of the deep is frozen. So now the ocean is frozen. And see, salt water is frozen. That has to be even colder than normal. Canst thou bind the cluster of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Now, our problem here is we have the translation of this, and the word Orion really means a star that's burly or has rings. And the word bands is the same word translated a rings, plural, in like a ring on your finger. And so there are rings for Orion. Orion is a star that is fat in the middle, and it is so it's fatter in one dimension in the middle than it is from top to bottom. And that's exactly what planets that have rings look like. The most prominent of those would be Saturn, of course, but there are several planets that have rings. Right here, the cluster of the Pleiades. Now, again, the translators interpreted this to be constellations in the sky of stars constellations. But I think they've missed it. I think this is Orion is a star, and the Hebrews didn't distinguish between a star and a planet. They didn't have a word to distinguish between them. And so I would say this is a planet with rings, and Pleiades is the 7 stars, or it is the planets that they could see. And so we see, I think here we're seeing planetary phenomena with regard to the flood itself. So the deep is frozen, and out of the womb comes ice that freezes the ocean. We will derive 3 points from this passage now. Notice we're going to get 3 points from it. sudden and seemingly in a certain location. Go back to Job 38:29. Out of whose womb came forth the ice, came sudden and came in a particular location as the birth would happen. Then the second thing is the deep. The ocean is frozen. Let's go back to this. And we see here the waters hide themselves, become like stone, and the face of the deep is frozen, verse 30. And then we see the last one, Orion, a star with rings or bands. And remember, the Hebrew did not distinguish between a star and a planet. They both would shine. And so it's related to ice. Let's go back to verse 31 again. Now, right here, can shall bind the cluster of the Pleiades or loose the bands of Orion? But he's been talking about the face of the deep being frozen, ice coming forth from a womb, as from a womb. Now, that's language. It's, of course, figurative language. But planetary rings, according to NASA probes, which they have gone to, they are measuring and they're looking at the rings of planets, and the bulk of what's in those rings is ice particles or chunks of ice. Sometimes they're quite small or just little pieces of ice because they bounce against each other and break each other up a bit. So they're ice particles of different sizes. Sometimes they're pretty big chunks. So planetary rings are mostly ice particles. There are some rocks and other stuff in them, but mostly ice. In order to determine the likely source of the ice caps, I'm going to synthesize, that is, I'm going to put together, and this is from two Greek words, this word synthesize, it's an English word, of course, but it means it's soon and thesis. And so the word for thesis is to set forth something. So I'm going to set forth and put together facts of nature, the laws of nature that are given by God, the entirety of the scriptures, those three things, and four things, the points developed in all the prior lessons. I'm going to synthesize, put all these things together. Now, first of all, the world perished with water. Let's look at this in 2 Peter 3, verses 5 and 6. For this they willfully forget that there were heavens from of old, and an earth compacted out of water, and amidst water by the word of God, by which means the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. Now notice the term overflow will fit a tidal flood quite well. That's what I'm claiming the flood was. The bulk of it was tidal, it was 40 days of rain, and then the rest of it was tidal action. But that 40 days of rain raised the ocean levels, and then the ice that came in with the planet that caused the flood, that caused the tidal action, that ice also, as it melts, has been raising the ocean levels as well. Now, in lessons, it was demonstrated that the destruction by the events of Genesis 6-9 was universal. So we had universal destruction. Some parts of the polar regions, however, do not have marine sedimentary rocks. There's some parts that don't have marine sedimentary rocks. We're going to show evidence, and this is one of my evidences, that the ice had to have been deposited concurrent or at the same time as the flood occurred. And now God didn't say, I will destroy the water, the life forms, and destroy the earth with liquid water. He said, I will destroy it with water. Now, water that's frozen, ice, is still water. So God could have destroyed with those two combinations. So some parts of the polar regions do not have marine sedimentary rocks. Some ice is merely frozen since it's nearly frozen water, since it is. It would be proper to say that water was involved if water and ice were used to destroy living creatures. So that would fit, and it wouldn't be contrary to the facts. Let's look in Axel Heiberg Island in northern Canada. The forest, according to a quote by Francis here, the forests are mummified, the wood is dry and somewhat compressed, but otherwise unchanged, and many trees reaching more than 100 feet in height. These are trees that were under the ice. And these trees were more than 100 foot tall. And that's a pretty tall tree to be up in the polar regions, in the Arctic regions. We'll see where this island is. We'll have a map here in just a few minutes. Extreme cold prevents decomposition by bacteria. That's why we put food in freezers. And the moisture is lost by sublimation. Now, this will mummify an organism. We call it freezer burn. But in sublimation, normally water has 3 states. Now, some materials have 4 states of matter: solid, liquid, gas, and a plasma. We're not going to worry about a plasma state of water here. But we have the solid state, ice, we call it ice. We have a liquid, we call it water, and then water vapor, we just call it water vapor. Now, water, frozen water, ice, sometimes does not go through the state of becoming a liquid. It goes directly from, and this is 1 molecule at a time, it goes directly from a solid state, ice, to water vapor. If there's enough energy, kinetic energy given by thermal action, the molecule can get enough energy to bypass the liquid state. And that's what happens with freezer burn. And you put meat in a freezer, and it'll eventually, the moisture will get out of it, and it'll be we'll have freezer burn. That'll mummify the organism. That's what we see here. These trees are mummified, and so the wood's dry. The liquid has been come out of it, and the trees are compressed. Well, they're compressed by the ice that laid on top of them. And they're somewhat unchanged, with many trees reaching more than 100 feet in height, back up to the Court of Francis on the top. So we have what we call freezer burn. That's sublimation is the correct term for it. In the 600th year, back to Genesis 7, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day where all the fountains of the great deep broken up, so the fountains of the deep were broken up, and I believe that was water coming out of the oceans due to tidal action. And the windows of heaven were opened. See, there's 2 different phenomena. And we've already shown that this term, it lasted 150 days. The rain only lasted 40. So it's not talking about the rain, because this windows of heaven, we've already shown, is lasted 150 days. And the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So there's 40 days of rain and nights. Then there was the windows of heaven for 150, and then there's the fountains of the deep for 150. So the windows of heaven and the fountains of the deep continued for 150 days, both of them the same length of time. Now, and God remembered Noah, Genesis 8:1, and all the beasts and all the cattle that were with him in the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged. Now let's stop a moment here. What causes winds? Well, we know that tidal action can cause winds. So we know that can happen because the moon's tides cause winds of about 1/20th of a mile per hour. And the winds rotate basically like the Coriolis effect. They rotate in a, let's see, I can't remember. And looking down from the top, it would be in a clockwise direction in the northern hemisphere and counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere. I believe that's correct. Yes. And so what we'd have then is the wind right now from the moon is 1/20th of a mile per hour. The wind does move that. The tide of the moon tides do cause it to move. Now, I believe that the planet that caused the flood came much, much closer, and it was larger than the moon, came much closer to the Earth. And my calculations of this, with the moon giving us 1/20th, and of course the forces increasing with not linearly, but in exponential fashion, I believe that there might have been winds of 150, 200 mile per hour during the flood at some times, okay? And so, but we say there were winds, made a wind to pass over the earth. Now, another thing that can cause winds is, of course, differences in temperature. And cold air is more dense than warm air, and so it will move under the warm air, and it will move from the cold region to the warmer region. And in the northern hemisphere, it moves from the North Pole toward the equator. Okay. And so in the United States, it moves out of the Arctic region in across Canada and across the Great Plains where I live in Oklahoma and down and goes south. So we get air masses coming out of the Arctic Ocean at certain times. Sometimes it comes out of Siberia and across the Arctic Ocean, and then it's really cold. So we call it a Siberian Express here. But the fountains of the deep windows of heaven were stopped at this point, and the rain from heaven was restrained. Now, you got to remember there's two different words translated rain in this context, Hebrew words. And the waters returned from off the earth continually, and after the end of 150 days, the waters decreased. So the waters did not decrease for 150 days, but it only rained 40 days. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. So we find here the tidal action continued. My model has the tidal action continuing for about 150 days. And three phenomena that were recorded in Genesis 7, 11, and 12 are the fountains of the deep lasting 150 days, windows of heaven lasting 150 days, the rain which lasted for 40 days. So again, we just need to read our Bibles carefully. We have those three phenomena. Certainly the word windows is figurative and probably a metaphor. And this metaphor, and I'm arguing it's a metaphor, and the other figurative expression in the context express the idea of an opening or region into which or through which something falls, like coming forth from a womb. And it would be concentrated in a given area where the birth occurs. It's reasonable to look for an explanation of the expression that conforms to these points. That is, the points we've already laid out here. The polar ice caps on the Earth are some distance from the geographic poles of the Earth. Now that's been a point of problem for the atheist and even for some flood models, because we have the ice caps are not in accordance with, they're not lined up with the polars, the geographic poles. And so they're not lined with the geographic poles. They're symmetrical, more symmetrical about the magnetic poles of the Earth than they are the geographic poles. But the magnetic poles should not affect the temperature. It's the geographic poles. The further you are from the equator toward the North Pole and South Pole, geographic, the colder it's going to get generally because you don't get as much sunlight. So that makes perfectly good sense, but not the magnetic poles have nothing to do with temperature. Since the magnetic poles of the Earth are some distance from the geographic poles of the Earth, this symmetry about the magnetic poles is probably significant. And I would argue there is something significant about it. This may be related to what we call the northern lights. The aurora borealis, that's Latin for northern lights, and the aurora australis, that's the southern lights. We see both of those. I've seen the northern lights, and they are beautiful to watch and see. But these phenomena, we're not going to spend more time on the northern lights and the southern lights, but they're related to the magnetic field of the Earth and are symmetrical about the magnetic fields, not about the geographic poles. So the symmetry is about the magnetic fields, not the geographic poles of the northern lights. These auroras are caused by charged particles which are entering the atmosphere in the regions of the magnetic poles. Charged particles coming from the sun primarily. These charged particles then, when they enter the atmosphere, we will get a law of physics that tells us that the forces placed upon the particle, not depending on whether it's positive or negative charge, but the forces will be at a right angle to the magnetic field. In other words, if the magnetic field is moving up, straight up, then the forces will either be to the left or the right on the horizontal axis. So there'll be a 90-degree angle to it. So the charged particles. And these particles then enter and they move along and run parallel to the magnetic field and go into the atmosphere where the magnetic field goes in. And so that's why these aurora borealis and aurora australis are about the magnetic fields. Now, right here, we see a drawing. We see the sun with its magnetic field, and we see the Earth. And these charged particles coming from the sun, when they hit the magnetic fields, they begin to be deflected at right angles to it. And they tend to go parallel to the magnetic fields. And they'll go in at the polar regions. Now, I have the magnetic fields drawn coming out of the top of the Earth, but actually they're coming out the side up here. So there's a tilt in this. It's not directly with the geographic pole. The Earth's magnetic field is moving, and we know that. We'll talk about that a bit. But that's the aurora borealis and the aurora australis. Of course, the Earth is tilted on its axis, and that tilt causes aurora borealis at one time, and 6 months later, approximately, the aurora australis. And so it depends on the tilt of the Earth to a certain extent as well. Are there questions so far? It is the principle of physics that a moving charge will have its path change when it encounters a magnetic field. Charged particle will travel in a path that is parallel to the magnetic field eventually. That's what it'll do. It'll move so that it runs parallel to the magnetic field. It's the same principle. What's the electron beam in a TV cathode ray tube is swept across the screen. Now, we don't have TVs that are that way anymore. Most of our TVs are digital now. But the old televisions with that electron beam in them, they would use a magnetic field to sweep it across the screen. And so that's how the old picture tube, TV picture tube operated. Cathode ray tube it's called. Okay. Now here's what the Earth is tilted on its axis. Here's the magnetic field of the Earth. And then the solar wind pushes on that magnetic field and misshapes it. And so it goes out more like this on the backside, and on the front side, it's like this. So the Earth's atmosphere here, we see the Earth's atmosphere. That's called a bow shock. This solar wind, these high-speed charged particles coming from the sun, push the magnetic field and cause it to be misshapen. And of course, then these particles then are funneled in toward the North Pole, toward the North magnetic pole, not the geographic pole. We have the southern lights down here and the northern lights up here, right? Now, any questions? So solar wind particles then are deflected off and away. So we have here now it's called a bow shock, and that's from the particles there moving. Now, ice particles, H2O ice particles. Now, there's other ice. There's other things that have ice too. So we're talking about water ice, H2O ice. Particles are diamagnetic, according to Wolfson and Pascoff, page 772, which helps to explain why most of the ice was deposited in the polar regions. Why? Because the ice particles are diamagnetic. Now, there's three kinds of materials. There's ferromagnetic and diamagnetic and paramagnetic materials. Gets into some physics, but the stronger magnetic field would give even more reason for the ice, which is diamagnetic, to be deposited near the magnetic poles. My argument is that the magnetic field of the Earth has been decreasing since the creation, and that it was much stronger then during the flood than it is now, and it is continuing to decrease. Now, we'll explain this in just a minute. Wolfson and Pascoff is a university level physics book. Even materials with no intrinsic magnetic moments. Now, ferromagnetic material can be magnetized at room temperature, is what that means. And there's three basic elements that can be magnetized, and there's some other things that they can combine, such as some ceramics. And that would be the three elements would be iron, nickel, and cobalt. Okay, at room temperature, it can be magnetized. But they've come up with other materials that are ceramic type materials that are even more, they can be more strongly magnetized. but these will be ferromagnetic materials. Paramagnetic materials can be magnetized if you get them cold. And a ruby, a gemstone ruby, and gadolinium, gallium, garnet. A garnet stone can be also magnetized if you get it cold enough. You drop a ruby into a bottle of liquid nitrogen, take a magnet, and it'll pick that ruby up. But whenever the ruby starts warming up, it'll drop it. And so it's paramagnetic. But what we have here is we have something different, and that's diamagnetic. If you look up here, that's what we're looking at, diamagnetic. So we're looking at diamagnetic. We're going to talk about them now. And Wolfson and Patskoff are going to talk about them now. Even materials with no intrinsic magnetic moments can have magnetic moments induced when a magnet approaches or when an applied magnetic field otherwise changes. So when it approaches a magnet or the magnetic field changes. So if these ice particles are moving toward the Earth due to gravitational attraction, they'll move through the magnetic field of the Earth. So that's what would happen. Such materials are termed diamagnetic. So they will have a moment induced. In contrast to ferromagnetic materials, diamagnetic materials are repelled by magnets. So they're repelled, they're pushed away by the magnets. So the magnetic field of the Earth would push them away, and they would tend to try to go parallel to the magnetic flux lines. Again, they would move in that manner so as to move parallel to the flux line, and they would move toward the Earth due to gravity and be pulled parallel to the flux lines, be pulled in at the polar regions. So that's my argument for these particles coming to the polar regions, where the magnetic field comes in to the Earth. Diamagnetic property of water would cause the ice to be deflected toward the magnetic poles as they were accelerating toward the Earth into the Earth's intense magnetic field, much more intense than it is now. This might help to explain the figures are coming from a womb in Job 38:29 and the windows of heaven. They'd come through a window or a narrow place, like a lattice, and it would come through that hole, basically, that's around the magnetic field where it comes down to the Earth, comes out of the Earth. Regions where the magnetic fields enter the Earth would serve as windows to which ice could enter the atmosphere. Remember, ice is not ferromagnetic, it's not paramagnetic, okay? It's diamagnetic. So this is the explanation of the windows. Now, my next diagram is going to explain the simultaneous deposition of ice and tidal activity. The polar cusp of the diagram depicts the deposition of ice. Here's your polar cusp up here. We come back to it. The ice would tend to come in the polar region around it, going in parallel to these magnetic flux lines. So again, my argument is that flux was stronger at that time than it is now. And the particles moving as they moved would tend to they would not try to cross the flux lines because they'd have a moment or a force placed upon them. So it would tend to keep them going parallel to the flux lines, and they'd go into these regions. We'd have some going, if the ice was down in this region, it would go into the South Pole. And so again, here's my figure on it. These particles would move, go back. These particles would move in this direction. Now, the planet, my model has the planet coming in from above. So the model here, that it should be down here. I should have drawn my diagram down here. But the ice would go toward the polar region, some of it, and some of them to the North Pole, and some to the South Pole. When it was up in this region coming in, I think the first pass came in like this, and that would deposit ice in the polar region. It would go in like this. As it swung down here, its ice would be pulled away into the Antarctic, the South Pole. So the planet went like this, and then the next pass, the sun is pulling on it. The first pass, it went like this. Next pass, it come back around, and it went out here like this. And then the third, and went out a little further, and come back in, got a little closer to the Earth, went out again, and this time it come out like this, and it's pretty well lifted up here. Now, the planet, then this would be, I think, the planet Mercury, and that it had ice rings. Well, we'll give more evidence for that later. Okay. So I would say that it was planet Mercury. Each time it moved more up into the ecliptic plane is an imaginary line from the center of the Earth to the center of the sun that moved upward and toward the ecliptic plane with the gravity of the sun tugging upon it. Okay. Any questions? And here are your sheets of ice. We have two ice sheets, Cordilleran ice sheet and then Laurentine ice sheet. I believe these came at different times, and there's a region down and through here. There's a gap between them. And this gap would allow living organisms, various animals, to traverse down through here and get down into this region. So a lot of your animals then were able to migrate across here. Of course, the Bering Sea was frozen over at this time. So this is the two ice sheets. And these ice sheets would have come with different passes of the planet, with the ice rings of the planet coming off. So a Laurentine ice sheet. Now this heavy ice load would tilt the northern, North America. It would tilt it. The top of it up here would be tilted. It would sink into the magma. The bottom would be lifted up a bit. And then as this ice melts, this is going to shift. Isostasy, I-S-O-S-T-A-C-S-Y, or C-Y, I think. So that's the isostasy would be adjusted. So right here, we have the geographic pole up here, and we have the magnetic pole down here. Now, it is moving if you do some research on it. And it has been for several hundred years. They've been measuring it since the 1600s. But it has been moving, and it's still moving. And that causes a problem for them. Why would it move? And how is it moving? Now, my model is going to explain how it moves and why it's moving. Okay. Questions so far? Okay. Now, here's the movement of the Earth's magnetic field from 1831, 1904, 1948, and we can see it continuing to move north. It's moving. So that magnetic field is and it's actually moving on us. Okay. Now, here's why I'm saying it came in. It came in at an angle above the Earth, above the ecliptic plane. Ecliptic plane. So this is tilted here. Now, when we look at the Earth's magnetic and geographic poles, we can see the north magnetic pole is up here, and the geographic north pole, that's actually a mistake. The pole up here is actually a south magnetic pole, but don't worry about that. It's a south magnetic pole because the north pole on the compass points to it, and opposites attract in magnetics. So this is a south magnetic pole at the north geographic region. But they're calling it geographic north pole. We'll just let them get by with it, okay? I copied this out of a book, okay? But they're wrong on that. And I think when they reprinted the book later, I found out they had changed it to a south magnetic pole. But what we have here, they're offset by about 11 degrees. We're going to explain this offset a little bit later. And so the magnetic equator runs kind of like this. So it's not straight across here. So there is some actual irregularity to it. Now there are geographic anomalies too. We'll be looking at those. Anomaly is something that doesn't follow the laws. Doesn't follow the law, okay? So our ice rings now will be pulled off and go to the top and to the bottom. And so these ice rings then will be moving toward the north or south pole, depending on where the planet was at that time. So let's look at the orbit of the planets here just for a few minutes and see what we can get on them. Here's the sun, and we'll make it a circle. It's pretty well spherical. And the planet, and here's a planet, and we're going to take the Earth, for example. And the orbit of the Earth around the sun is an ellipse. It's egg-shaped. And what happens is that sometimes it's closer than other times. Now that gets into some mathematics of it, but it's not that difficult mathematics, but it does get into some mathematics. We won't worry about it any further. I'm just going to tell you that's what it is. Okay. Now, uniformitarian geology would demand that the ice should exist as scattered icebergs in the Arctic Ocean. Why? Because snowfall would have caused the glaciers. Now, snow is by very nature of it, it's not salt water. Snow is by nature, it's fresh water. And it's fairly pure fresh water. So it's going to freeze at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 degrees Celsius at room temperature, at standard barometric pressure, that is. So the snowfall would have been causing the glaciers, according to uniformitarian geology. And so the ice, what would happen is there would be ice on the islands. Snow would form the ice. Then it would go down into the ocean. Now, what happens is the freezing point of water, and I'll use Fahrenheit here, is 32 degrees Fahrenheit if it's pure water. And now if it's ice water, it is down the line 10, 12 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on how much ice water. Snow water, if it's salt water will freeze, but it has to be colder. And it has to be something like 10, 12, 14 degrees. And of course, it's going to depend on how much salt is in the snow. So salt water will melt in the summer times. And this happens in the Arctic region. So the islands that we see up in the northern regions right now, in the Arctic regions, what will happen is the ice will be there in the winter and it'll freeze over the ocean. So there'll be a going across from one island to the other. Polar bears can walk across. But in the summertime, that ice that's in the ocean melts, and the polar bears either have to swim all the way back or stay on the island where they were stranded. So snowfall would have caused the glaciers. So the glaciers would not be connected and related to one another. There wouldn't be a massive glacier across all of the islands, covering the ocean as well. The basic thesis of my model, Fox's model, is correct. The ice should be in one continuous sheet rather than in isolated glaciers. Okay. So that's my model, would have it in one big sheet. Glaciologists, according to Holden, have long debated what sort of ice covered the Arctic region during the last ice age. Most have agreed it was thin sea ice and scattered icebergs, just as it is today. Now, watch this, researchers have found signs that huge icebergs with record deep keels, now a keel on a ship is the bottom of the ship, once drifted out of the Arctic, signs that there may have been an Arctic ice sheet after all. In other words, now there's evidence that there was one big ice sheet. That won't fit snow, but it will fit my model. Ice raining down out of the cosmic ice that's near absolute zero, raining down through these windows of heaven. That will fit my model, but it won't fit the snow model. First, deep grooves were carved by the keels of huge icebergs, 300 to 700 meters. That's approximately 984 to 2,300 feet deep. That's a pretty deep iceberg. A submerged ridge in the scrape marks that were beveled smooth. And that's Holden, page 735. He's talking about all this ice, these huge ice sheets that my model says should have occurred. And so now we have the scraping of the ridges, and they beveled it off as these ice sheets moved around, as the water moved them. Holden says these icebergs were twice the thickness of present icebergs in Antarctica. Huge, very thick icebergs. There have been some icebergs in my lifetime come out of Antarctica that are almost the size of Luxembourg. Just huge, huge, huge icebergs. 60, 70 miles across them. And according to this, they were much larger than the present icebergs. Scientist Allen and Waters said that the ice extended off the continents and out over the Arctic Ocean. See, because their model said it shouldn't happen. Their model said it should have been by snow. And we see what happens in the summer. The snow ice melts, and when it gets out of the ocean in the summertime, and then so they're not attached. It's not one big ice sheet. They suspect that the Arctic oceans are those surrounded by vast plateaus of ice was not itself very different from the way it is today. Now, research from the Arctic floor, this is another source, suggests a mass of thick floating ice that did bridge the continents. Fox's flood model is proven to be correct. My flood model is correct here. Allen and Waters tell us circumstantial evidence supports the theory that it was a single ice sheet rather than icebergs. Now notice here, we got Holden, and we got Allen and Waters. We got Allen and Waters again. Circumstantial evidence supports the theory that it was a single ice sheet rather than icebergs. The scratches are parallel. For example, while most iceberg scratches are randomly oriented. Why would they be randomly oriented? The tides would move the icebergs around one way and then the other as the tides moved in and out. And as the water moved and as wind moved the water. But these are not, they're not random. They're parallel to one another, reflecting the wanderings of drifting icebergs. Now, if you studied German, B-E-R-G is a mountain, B-U-R-G is a castle, okay? But let's move away from that. Another clue that thick ice covered the Arctic Ocean during the ice ages comes from sediments drilled from the seafloor. So there's other sources, other information that proves that they were thick ice sheets. And so, again, this shoots down the idea that it was caused by snow. The continuous ice cap could be easily explained by cosmic ice, not by terrestrial ice snowfall. Saltwater has a much lower freezing point than freshwater, as I've already pointed out. Saltwater ice in the Arctic Ocean tends to thaw in the summer and melt. So it thaws out and melts. Or it turns back to ice water. It's still cold water, but it's not frozen. Now, if you put salt on the roads and it's down to 0 degrees Fahrenheit, the salt won't do anything. It won't melt the ice. It'll just be salt. Ice. The snow will be salty, but it won't melt it. It has to get up like 15 degrees Fahrenheit or somewhere thereabouts for the ice, for the salt to melt the ice, 12, 13, 14 degrees Fahrenheit. This breaks the ice caps into individual caps on the islands, which would expand outward as the salt water froze in the winter and would retreat to land as it melted during the summers. That's what we would have if it was snow ice. This is what presently occurs in the Arctic Ocean today. As it expands out and goes back in summertime, ships can go through. Now, let's look at our ecliptic plane. We're getting near the end of the class. Go on another 5 or 10 minutes, then we'll stop. The ecliptic plane is this. What we have is, here's the Jovian planets, the large planets, and here's the inner planets, the terrestrial planets. This would be your 4 terrestrial planets: Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. All right. And then, of course, Pluto, which they've determined is not a planet anymore. Okay. But what we have here is these are all lined up at the same level. That's called an ecliptic plane. If you go make an imaginary line from the center of the sun through the Earth, that's called the ecliptic plane. And now we have out here, we have this asteroid belt out here, and we'll get back to that later. We'll come into that just a little bit later. But we have some interesting things about these Jovian planets. Jove, I think, is the name that Latin-speaking people, people from Rome that they gave to the god that some others called, well, they called him Jupiter, the Greeks did, and they called him Jove, I believe. I think that's what the Romans called them, Latin-speaking people.
Okay.
That false god, of course. So we're going to stop here and get into the mechanism of the ice deposition next class period. Are there any questions before we go away from it?
Yeah, I might have missed it. Did you show the map where the island was, where those trees were at?
No, I didn't. I'm sorry. We will have to do that next week. I think it's in the material for us.
Okay, thank you.